We're going to connect with Joseph Sabit, who is at the airport, where a renowned human rights constitutional lawyer and activist will be jetting into the country. PLO Lumumba is coming into the country. And I guess he would love to share his thoughts on national dialogue. But you seem to be replicating someone's template. But you could answer that shortly after connecting with Joseph Sabiti. Joseph, has Lumumba landed? And what are his thoughts on the national dialogue?
Well, a very good morning to you, Simon, and to our viewers from Entebbe International Airport. The astute lawyer and Pan-Africanist has jetted into the country already. And let me just continue the conversation that you're having in regard to the national dialogue. It comes from a country that is debating what is called the handshake between the opposition leader Raila Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta, and it has caused a lot of political fracas in the country. But, Prof, welcome to Uganda.
Thank you very much.
First of all, what are your views about the concept of a national dialogue in Africa?
National dialogue in any country is always to be praised, because politics is about dialogue, constructive dialogue. So nobody can quarrel with dialogue, but dialogue for what? Is it for personal benefit or for the national good? This is the question that we must ask. Everywhere in the world, people engage in politics because they want to use politics for the benefit of their people. The problem in Africa is that sometimes it is used for short-term personal interests of politicians.
Okay. The conversation in Uganda now is whether or not to actually have that dialogue. And what forms a decent national dialogue in your view?
Dialogue must be for something. The people of Uganda must determine for themselves that there are outstanding issues which require that the people engage. And if they are of the considered view that there are those issues, then they must be encouraged to discuss those issues, because they are of national importance, not only for now, but for the foreseeable future. Because if people don't dialogue and engage in constructive dialogue, then things may be torpedoed in a direction that will be harmful to the nation.
Okay. The common Ugandan won't have the chance to set the agenda and determine the ideas to be discussed, do they?
They can make demands. History has demonstrated that when people are organized, irrespective of the position that they wield, they can make demands. We see people making demands in Algeria. We see people making demands in Sudan. We see people making demands in other countries. There is no reason why the so-called common Ugandan or common African, if they are properly organized, cannot make demands of their leaders.
Okay. What about the consequences of these demands? You've mentioned Algeria, you've mentioned the Arab Spring and other countries. The consequences?
The ultimate desire of every demand is that it produces the goods that the people deserve and desire. And what are these goods? That there is good public health system, that there is good education, that there are employment opportunities, that the quality of people's lives are improved. But of course, if it is not properly organized, it can also harm a nation. History has demonstrated many times that if agitation is agitation for agitation's sake, then all the gains that have been achieved can be torpedoed and the country can go back to the dark ages.
What role does politics play in a national dialogue on the African continent, in the African context?
Is it not Socrates who said that man is a political animal and that everything that we do is essentially politics? When we talk about politics, we mean the organization of human affairs for the benefit of human beings, and therefore everything we engage in is political in nature.
Okay. Yes. What about the big man syndrome? I was quoting the Kenyan scenario. It has become more of Raila Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta. The big man syndrome in Africa. Yes.
That is the problem of Africans. The misguided belief by Africans that their political leaders are messiahs to be compared with Moses holding a rod in his hand and parting Red Seas. My view is that democracy is a competition of ideas, and those who have ideas put them in the marketplace and the people choose. But unfortunately, in many African countries, first of all, we are wedded to ethnicity. Number two, we are wedded to demigods. And once you choose that path, then you've got to pay the consequences. When you treat people like God for too long, they begin to think that they are God, and they begin to behave like God, and they begin to think that they are infallible. And you pay the consequences. And Africa is doing so and will continue to do so until the day our eyes are opened.
So does democracy then have a future in Africa? Isn't it a misplaced concept here?
This thing called democracy. First of all, in Africa, we allow the Western Europe to define for us what democracy is. We are told that democracy must mean elections after every 5 years. We are told that democracy must mean political parties. We are told that democracy must be endorsed by Western Europe and European Union at every election cycle. We must ask ourselves, what is democracy? Is participation of the people. Is it possible for us to define for ourselves what democracy means, as long as it means participation of the people? Africa allows ourselves to be defined by others, and that is my pain and our tragedy.
Does Africa have the capacity to define itself, putting into perspective the colonial injustices, the level of poverty, and the dependence on foreign aid to run African affairs?
We are not the only people who are colonized. The Indians were colonized. The Chinese had an element of colonization. The Koreans were colonized. There is a sense in which we must now liberate ourselves from this argument that colonization and slavery cannot be taken out of our reasoning. I believe we have the capacity, and there is no shortage of Africans who are speaking from different corners of the world. But unfortunately in Africa, despite the best intentions of the best of us, we are incapable of giving those people the opportunity to serve. But we have men and women who know what ought to be done. But Africans in their critical mass are not listening to the voices of reason, which cannot be heard even in their purest tones.
Let's talk about the concept of political parties in Africa. What are your views about the parties that exist? Do they contribute to this animal you call democracy?
First of all, do we have political parties in Africa? There are very few political parties. In Africa, I can only mention a few as constituting what I can refer to as political parties. Chama cha Mapinduzi in Tanzania is a political party. The ANC is a freedom movement converting into a political party. Frelimo is a freedom movement converting into a political party. MPLA in Angola. But in many countries, what we have are formations which are owned by individuals masquerading as political parties with no ideas. And they engage in elections every 5 years, and they change their names every 5 years. These are not political parties. Political parties must be underpinned by clear ideological foundations which inform the quality of people's lives in its different facets. What we must therefore do is to ask ourselves, do African political parties qualify to be called political parties in the classical sense? My answer, very few of them qualify.
All right. I know you'll be speaking later to the nation and the young people about the concept of elections in Africa. Aren't we getting somewhere as a continent in regard to the quality of elections?
We are moving. There are quite a number of countries which have engaged in elections which are to be commended, and I think there is a sense in which, despite the many difficulties that we continue to confront and to surmount, Africa is moving in some direction. Perhaps not at the pace that we desire, but we are moving. But we must continue moving.
Okay. One of the obstacles cited in that move forward is the role of the security agencies and government institutions in elections. What needs to be done? How do we make Africa great?
Africa is still, and there is a sense sometimes when we talk about Africa, there is the tendency to generalize, to assume that Africa is one country. Africa is 55 odd countries with very different backgrounds because of colonization. There were those that were colonized by the French, who are technically still colonized by the French, those colonized by the English, the Portuguese, and the Spanish, and there are those that are reeling out of the apartheid regime. And there is a sense, therefore, that when I talk about Africa, I'm very conscious that generalization does not begin to address the realities. But the truth is that Africa has many problems, but it can solve those problems if we identify them and begin to confront them in a manner that is obedient to our realities on the ground. But there are many people out there who are not interested in peace in Africa because chaos and insecurity is also a major source of wealth. And you asked the question, what is the role of security agencies? It is true that in many countries we still see the involvement of the disciplined forces in the political process in a very direct way. And one may say that this is sometimes informed by the history of those countries. And I hold the view that each country must make a decision. But the desired position is that the disciplined forces must remain in the barracks and only be called when there is need for them outside.
All right, my final question to you before I let you go. There has been this animal called the East African Community moving towards a federation, but the last few years have seen wars over Mijingo between Uganda and Kenya. Rwanda recently closed its borders, and then Kenya and Tanzania are fighting over whether or not to export birds to each country. What lies ahead for the East African Community?
I believe that if the political leaders and the people are ahead of the political leaders in terms of integration. If you go to the borders of Uganda and Kenya, to the borders of Uganda and Tanzania or Rwanda, the people are ahead. But remember that the political class have the tendency to slow things down, because sovereignty, if it is at a narrow level, gives people advantages. There are people who fear that when they get into the East African Federation, then they'll be swallowed. So that those who are big fish in small ponds do not want to be small fish in a lake or an ocean. But ultimately, East Africa will be realized, perhaps not in your lifetime, perhaps not in my lifetime, but we are moving forward there.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Prof, for sparing time to speak to us. Right there, Professor PLO Lumumba will be speaking to the country and to the young people later. He heads to the Speak Resort, Munyonyo, right now to actually give a talk there. And so if you're interested, you could head there. He will also later be joining Charles Odongtho on NBS Frontline. And so you can have the conversation now. Hashtag NBS Frontline. Charles Odongtho will be, of course, continuing the conversation from where we have left it. For now, let's cross back to the command center of politics, where Simon Kagwanjala continues with the conversation.
Thank you very much. And from the Political Command Center, we can only say what a beautiful interview. Off the cuff, PLO Lumumba will be a guest on the Frontline tonight. Again, he will be raising some of the key issues that would inform the trajectory of Uganda and the East Africa. If I could